They mistook your calm for compliance, your stillness for softness, your silence for surrender. They assumed that because you didn't react the way they were used to, the way they could manipulate, you must have been nervy, maybe even weak. They couldn't see that you were sitting in an entirely different dimension of thought, a level where ego doesn't drive action, where validation isn't a currency, where reaction is reserved only for what deserves energy. They brought chaos to your doorstep like it was a test. What they didn't realize was that you'd already passed it. Years ago, you weren't born at this frequency. You earned blood, through fire, through brutal rebirths that reshaped your soul. They tried you because they couldn't see the shields in your eyes, shields built from nights where you met your demons and shook hands with them. They were used to scaring people with volume, with gossip, with guilt, with games. But none of it landed on you, and it drove them mad, because their usual tools didn't dent your armor, and when those tools failed, they panicked. That's when it started to dawn on them. Maybe you weren't playing the same game. Maybe you were never meant to be controlled, only tested. And the moment they tested you, they realized they were kneeling in the presence of someone who had buried versions of themselves they wouldn't survive meeting. See, your power never needed an introduction. It didn't have to roar, it breathed, it whispered. And that's what made it dangerous. You didn't arrive to prove anything. You arrived to witness, to observe, to measure. And they failed their own test the second they underestimated the quiet inside you. They thought they were setting traps, not realizing you had built mazes. They thought they were challenging you, not knowing they were stepping into your arena. Because people don't recognize spiritual elevation when it doesn't look mystical. They expect flowing robes and ancient chants. They don't expect surgical silence, weaponized peace, and a gaze that strips illusions like flesh. You didn't punish them. That's what really broke them. You let them learn. You didn't stoop. You didn't snap. You just let the gravity of their actions collapse inward. That's how they found out. Not because you told them, not because you cursed them, but because your alignment was so unshakable, the universe responded on your behalf. Life started mirroring their malice back at them. Doors began to close. Relationships soured. Reputations cracked. And there you were, unbothered, burned, unreadable, because you had ascended above the battlefield. You had transcended the drama, and in doing so, you became untouchable. They still don't understand what level you're on, because they've never met someone who can disappear from chaos without losing power, who can forgive without forgetting, who can sever without scorning. You didn't leave them with scars, you left them with clarity, and that clarity haunted them. It made them question every move, every mask, every motive. You became their reckoning, not because you wanted revenge, but because truth echoes in chambers where lies used to live. And your silence, it became the echo they couldn't stop hearing. You reached a level where peace became your retaliation, where growth became your rebuttal. You didn't seek to destroy them. You simply refused to be destroyed. And that refusal, that spiritual warfare at its highest form, not reacting when provoked, not engaging when baited, not descending when pulled, you rose, again, until rising became your signature. They tried to wound you, and you used the wound to breathe deeper. They tried to trigger you, and you turned the trigger into a compass. They tried to study you like a weakness, and ended up documenting their own flaws in the process. You exist in a state now that they can't decode, a frequency that rejects noise and feeds only on truth. You're not untouchable because you're perfect. You're untouchable because you're in tune. You've done the shadow work. You've walked through your own fire, uncovered the roots of your patterns, dismantled every illusion they still hide behind. You know yourself. And that knowledge, that's the force field. That's what makes your presence both uncomfortable and magnetic. You don't chase. You don't plead. You align. And the moment someone tries to destabilize you, they realize they're wrestling with something they cannot name. They still talk about you in riddles. They'll never admit it directly, but your name brings heat to their skin. Thought. Not because of what you did, but because of what you didn't need to do. You didn't explain, you didn't defend, you didn't react. You just were. You became the lesson they thought they were teaching. You became the one they speak of like a parable. Don't mess with them. They whisper. Something about them, it's different. And it is. You're not just operating in another league. You're in another realm entirely. One where truth doesn't need to shout, because it radiates. So let them try. Let them test. Let them dig graves with their pride. You've walked this earth in silence long enough to know that divine power needs no audience. That sacred alignment needs no apology. You've become the kind of soul that doesn't chase karma. It becomes it. And when they came for you, thinking you were another pawn to rearrange, they realized too late they had invoked something ancient, something pure, something dangerous. You weren't reacting. You were watching. And by the time they understood the depth of your stillness, their fate had already answered back. You don't just rise. You dismantle through presence, through patience, through pain you've already survived in solitude. That's the level they couldn't fathom. That's why they lost before they even knew they were in a game. Because while they were counting reactions, you were measuring souls. And now they live with the truth they discovered too lating. The worst mistake isn't underestimating someone powerful. It's underestimating someone aligned. You weren't a threat because you fought back. You were a threat because you didn't need to. And that's when they realized they hadn't tried a person. They had tried a force. They expected you to break character and descend, to get your hands dirty trying to dismantle what was already rotting. They assumed that because they'd chosen vengeance as their instrument, you would respond in kind, that you'd match energy, that you'd spiral, posture, retaliate. But they didn't realize you had already evacuated that frequency. You didn't plot, you purified. You didn't collapse into anger, you ascended into silence. You let them wage war in a theater you no longer performed in. And that's what shattered Thing. The realization that their cruelty wasn't met with resistance. It was met with irrelevance. You weren't fighting, you weren't floating, above their pettiness, beyond their reach. They prepared for your retaliation the way cowards do, by surrounding themselves with witnesses. They told stories in advance, rewrote timelines, set the stage for the chaos they thought you'd unleash. But nothing came. No retaliation, no rebuttal. Just calm. The kind of unsettling calm that makes guilty hearts panic. You didn't react the way they scripted. And now every room they walk into feels like a courtroom. Because your absence has become louder than any accusation. That's what they didn't account for. The slow erosion of power that comes someone refuses to play your game. You didn't need to strike back. You simply rose until they were left fighting shadows below. They thought your restraint was weakness, thought your silence was shock. But the truth was far more haunting. You had already made peace with the betrayal before they even executed it. While they were busy calculating how to wound you, you were studying how to free yourself without vengeance poisoning your bloodstream. You were vibrating at a level where wounds don't metastasize into vendettas. They evaporate into wisdom. You didn't want revenge because revenge requires proximity. And you were already too far ahead, too evolved, too detached to turn around for a battle that had nothing left to teach you. What broke them wasn't your wrath, it was your peace. They prepared for war and met a monastery. They expected screams and got stillness. That's a psychological collapse few recover from, because people who harm others often survive by imagining their targets as equally broken, equally petty, equally vengeful. But when you showed no desire to return the wound, when you stood there, whole, radiant, quiet, it exposed them. It made the damage they inflicted feel one-sided, unnecessary, cruel. That asymmetry began to eat away at them. You didn't raise a hand. You raised a standard, and that alone ruined their narrative. You reached a place where revenge became too cheap a currency for your energy. You started investing in peace, in elevation, in legacy. You realized revenge is loud, but healing is surgical, and you preferred the scalpel to the grenade. You began sculpting a life so powerful, so self-contained, that their betrayal became a footnote, not a foundation. You didn't just move on, you moved up, and from that altitude the air was too clean to drag the past along. They were hoping to become your obsession. You made them your lesson. And in doing so, you removed every string they thought they could pull. Your presence became their punishment, because you're not better, you're better. And nothing is more haunting to someone who tried to break you than your ability to shine anyway. You don't mention them. You don't curse them. You don't even acknowledge the fallout they tried to engineer. But every time your name is spoken with respect, every time you thrive in silence, every time your peace interrupts their drama, they feel it. They feel the wound they gave you curling inward, not on your skin, but under theirs. You outgrew revenge because you understood something fundamental: fire doesn't chase smoke. They expected destruction and were faced with reconstruction. And what crushed them most was the realization that they had become irrelevant to your story. That you'd taken every shard they tried to pierce you with and built a mosaic of something they'll never touch. They can't even call you an enemy anymore, because to be an enemy, you must still be engaged. But you disengaged. You disconnected so cleanly that they now grasp at ghosts. They needed you to stay in the fight so they could feel validated. But you became their consequence by choosing evolution over retaliation. You saw through the trap. Revenge is addictive, but healing is freedom. And you chose freedom, not just from them, but from the version of you who would have needed to prove something. You stopped needing proof. You became it. You moved in silence so potent it swallowed the noise they made. And now, every echo of their name reminds the world, not of your fall, but of your rise. You didn't defeat them with weapons. You defeated them with absence. You disappeared from their battlefield and reappeared on a throne they never knew existed. Underneath your silence, they assumed weakness. They projected their own instability onto your restraint, labeling it indecision, when in truth, it was the clearest signal of control. They couldn't understand a power that didn't flex. They couldn't recognize alignment because they'd never met it. And so, they mistook your stillness for a lack of direction, mid-thought. They thought you were quiet because you didn't know what to say. They thought you were passive because you hadn't chosen your stance. What they failed to realize was that you had already made your decision long before they opened their mouths. You were simply observing, calculating, grounding, waiting for the moment when precision would speak louder than performance. They didn't understand that a quiet individual aligned with purpose is a more dangerous force than a loud fool flailing for attention. Because while they spent their time performing, you were sharpening. Every pause of yours was deliberate, every silence a blade being forged. You weren't avoiding the conflict, they were beneath it. Beneath you. You knew their psychology before they knew your name, and still you let them dance, let them gloat, let them project their delusions of dominance. But your patience, that was the real predator. You knew that when the moment came, you wouldn't need to raise your voice. You'd only need to move once, and the entire room would feel the shift. They underestimated the architecture of someone rooted. You weren't waiting for approval, you were protecting your energy. That unnerved them, because people who operate on impulse cannot trust those who operate on discipline. You weren't emotionally absent, you were emotionally aligned. And when someone is aligned, their silence isn't emptiness, it's surveillance. Your quiet was not confusion, it was a prelude, a gathering of momentum, a centering of self. The calm before a choice that would cut clean through their chaos. You weren't ignoring them. You were dismantling them internally without even touching the surface. They fumbled in your presence, trying to provoke you into the narrative that made sense to them. They needed you loud. Loud people are easier to dismiss. Loud people can be labeled unstable, aggressive, insecure. But you stayed quiet. You gave them nothing, and nothing is the one thing most people cannot handle. Because when you don't respond, they're left with themselves. Their words echo, their behavior reflects. They begin to see what you already saw, that they are a collection of insecurities dressed as authority. And your silence, it reveals that faster than any insult could. They never saw the ground you were standing on. They were too focused on your stillness to realize it was the stillness of someone rooted, grounded, aligned with something beyond their understanding. You weren't still because you were stuck. You were still because you were steady. And in a world addicted to motion and noise, steadiness looks suspicious. It looks dangerous. It feels like a threat. Because it is. You weren't participating in the chaos. You were watching the structure of it decay from within. And when it did, you were already 10 steps ahead, untouched. You didn't interrupt their ego trips with protests or confrontations. You let them expose themselves. The loudest in the room always declares their own instability first. You knew that. That's why you stayed centered while they spiraled. They needed you to react so they could make you the villain. But you had no interest in roles. You weren't auditioning, you were anchoring. And when the storm passed, and it always does, they realized you had never been caught in it. You were the one watching from the eye of it all, breathing in silence like oxygen. And now they remember you not as the soft one, not as the uncertain one, but as the one they couldn't shake, the one they couldn't predict, the one who didn't blink when everyone else flinched. You've become a symbol in their mind, a warning they whisper to others. Don't mistake quiet for fragile. We did, and we lost. They'll never know how close they were to something surgical. They thought the blade had to be loud to be sharp. But you cut with atmosphere. You cut with stillness. You cut by never lowering yourself to their level. You've become something their psychology cannot place, because you never fought their ego. You eclipsed it. You never danced with their petness. You absorbed it, let it dissolve, then walked through it untouched. That kind of poise disorients. That kind of clarity blinds. You showed them what it looks like when someone refuses to descend. And the higher you rose in your calm, the smaller they looked. Not because you tried to make them feel small, but because the contrast was too blinding to ignore. You didn't compete. You simply kept aligning, and they kept unraveling. So now they sit in silence, afraid of it, because they remember that's where you came from. That's where you won from. They're surrounded by noise, by people, by distractions, but none of it comforts them, because silence now sounds like you, like the thing they underestimated, like the force they never prepared for. And every quiet person they meet now, they hesitate, because your legacy taught them that sometimes silence is not surrender, it's a storm gathering strength. And by the time they hear it, it's already too late. You weren't unsure, you were untouchable. And their mistake wasn't exedging your volume, it was misreading your alignment. They tried to measure you by what they could hear, but your depth, your power, it was felt, not heard. And once it moved, once it was finally unleashed, it didn't shout. It simply changed everything. Your composure wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't scripted in a mirror or learned through mimicry. It was earned, in pain, in silence, in the unseen battles that frigid your restraint like tempered steel. They thought you were calm because you were practiced, because you wanted to appear mature or impressive. But you weren't trying to appear anything. You were surviving what they couldn't even comprehend. Every quiet breath you take now has been purified in a fire they never saw. And so when they try to provoke you, when they try to make you slip into a version of yourself that screams or scrambles, they meet something that feels ancient. You don't need to. Keep your cool. You are the cool. And that difference unsettles them. They can't comprehend that your stillness wasn't performance. It was evolution. You didn't watch tutorials on how to be poised. You became poised by enduring storms no one checked on you during. The way you sit still now, that's not learned, that's welded into your bones, into your blood, into the tempo of your pulse. You trained in chaos. You found serenity in betrayal. You learned how to breathe under psychological pressure so deep it would drown them on contact. And now that you don't flinch, they think you're faking it. But you're not faking. You're finished. Done reacting. Done explaining. Done matching their panic. They try to poke holes in your presence. They study your timing. They look for cracks, assuming there must be a script you're following. But how do you explain to someone that your poise was purchased with years of disappointment? That your discipline is muscle memory from dodging manipulation and extracting yourself from chaos they have drowned in? They look at your calm and assume it's luck, or pretense, or some new persona. But what they're really feeling isn't your act. It's their own unraveling, because they've built entire personalities on reaction, and you've built an entire world on response. That's the threat. You don't over-explain, you don't spiral, you don't escalate, you observe, you move with surgical awareness. They scream, and you listen. They lie, and you remember. They attack, and you calculate. That kind of grounded energy terrifies the unstable, because it reminds them of what they've never built inside. You don't have to plan your reactions. You've trained your essence. Your silence hits harder than their shouting. And your gaze, that cold, unwavering gaze, it says what words never couldn't. I've already handled worse than you, and I did it alone. They can't figure out why they can't shake you, why their tactics bounce off, why their guilt trips expire in your presence. It's because they were built for drama, and you were refined by reality. There's no space in you for performance. You stopped pretending years ago. You died to that version. And the new you, The composed one, the grounded one, the dangerously calm one, isn't pretending to be unfazed. You genuinely are, because you've already grieved the betrayal, already outgrown the need to be understood, already buried the hunger for revenge. What's left is someone who doesn't need to win the argument, because they already own their peace. They tried everything to unhinge you. Emotional bait, passive-aggressive whispers, public challenges masked as concern, but you didn't flinch. You didn't defend. You didn't respond on their terms. Because you understood something they didn't. Control is not the absence of emotion. It's the management of it. You felt everything. You just didn't show them. You had your earthquakes in private, rebuilt your center in silence, and returned with an energy that felt too clean to confront. You became the room, and they realized they couldn't contaminate it. Their failure to provoke you became the mirror they refused to look in. You didn't become unpredictable. You became unshakable. You weren't rehearsing your reactions. You were reprogramming your nervous system. And now when people try to touch the past triggers, nothing lights up, because you've dismantled the wiring. You don't collapse. You don't explode. You just remain. And in a world of chaos, that kind of stillness is unsettling. It makes people confess things they were trying to hide. It makes liars stutter. It makes manipulators panic, because nothing's scarier than someone who doesn't need to fight to win. And you didn't broadcast that transition. You didn't need to. The people who tried you figured it out during their games, not after. They saw it in real time, their plots unraveling mid-action, their strategy backfiring in front of an audience, all because you didn't react. You reflected, and in your reflection they saw themselves. That's the danger of real composure. It becomes a mirror too honest to survive. And when their egos cracked from the reflection, they couldn't blame you. You said nothing. You did nothing. You simply existed. And that existence was enough to end their illusions. They summoned chaos like it was an old friend, whispered rumors, stirred tensions, created illusions of betrayal in rooms you'd never even walked into. Their hands were dirty long before the conflict began, and their intent was never subtle. They invited every spirit of discord, hoping to provoke the collapse of something they couldn't control. You. But what they didn't account for was that you weren't anchored in ego, weren't dancing in the shallow pools of emotional impulse. You were somewhere else. Somewhere they didn't understand. You were seated inside yourself, untouchable, unmoved, operating in a state of divine detachment. And when their storms came, they were the only ones who drowned. You watched. With mercy, with clarity, with silence that said, I see you, but I will not join you. They thought noise would unseat you, that if they threw enough weight against your presence, something would crack. But they didn't understand that you'd already broken in private and rebuilt in ways that no chaos could touch. You weren't just resisting. You had transcended. You didn't deny the conflict. You just chose not to make it your home. And that refusal to participate in the circus made them furious, because people who thrive in conflict need others to play. They need mirrors, reaction, resistance. But you gave them none. You offered stillness, and in that stillness they saw themselves, unmasked, uninvited, unready. They tried to stir something inside you. Anything. They pushed your name into lies, your character into corners, your story into distortion. But you responded with nothing. Not indifference, but a deeper recognition. You saw them not as enemies, but as children masquerading in chaos. And instead of punishing them, you pitied them. That confused them even more, because when someone's soul is fueled by drama, and you offer them detachment, it feels like starvation. They expected fire, but met reflection. They were shouting in a temple, and you were the silence it echoed in. They couldn't survive your refusal to engage. It robbed them of their power. Their accusations decayed without your defense. Their performances fell flat without your reaction. You became an abyss they screamed into, hoping for echoes. But your detachment became the final curtain. They weren't performing for you anymore. They were performing for their own unraveling. And still, you didn't flinch, because your detachment wasn't coldness. It was sacred, hard-earned. It wasn't apathy, it was elevation. You had learned that peace is not passivity, it's precision. And that lesson rewrote the entire battlefield. They tried to make you fight your own name, but your name didn't belong to them. You'd already purified it in silence, in isolation, in seasons where no one clapped and no one cared. And because of that, their stories slid off you like smoke. You'd already built a world where your worth was not debated. You didn't need to defend yourself in rooms where they decided to misunderstand you. You'd already outgrown the need to be seen by those who only looked to distort. And so you walked, not away from the conflict, but above it.